Hi, I'm David Kais, and I run R for the rest of us. You may think of R as a tool for complex statistical analysis, but it's much more than that. From data visualization to efficient reporting to improving your workflow, R can do it all. On this podcast, I talk with people about how they use R in unique and creative ways. Well, I'm joined today by three folks, two who are currently at and one formerly from the Urban Institute, who work there and do a lot of parameterized reporting. So I'm delighted to be joined by Erin Williams, Livia Mucciolo, and Safia Syed. I am delighted to have you here, and thanks all three of you for joining. Maybe if we can just start out, I'll have you kind of one by one. Tell us your position at Urban, what you do there, and also kind of how you initially got into R. So maybe Erin, I'll have you start first.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. So I'm a senior data scientist in the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute and an adjunct professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. And I work with the data science team here at the Urban Institute. It's really great because Urban does a bunch of great policy work in a bunch of different domains, and I get to bounce around and wear a lot of different hats. And so I've worked a lot with the Tax Policy Center on data privacy issues, and that's how I got hooked up with them on this state and local finance initiative and this sort of parameterized reporting with Safia and Livia.
Cool. Thanks. And maybe Livia, we'll have you kind of introduce yourself, and then we'll actually I'll come back to you in a minute to have you talk about how you got into R. So Livia, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes. So I'm a research assistant at the Urban Institute, specifically in the Tax Policy Center. I've been there for almost 2 years. And I kind of work across the board within our center. So both on the federal tax microsimulator, where we analyze tax bills and provisions, and also on the state and local side, which is where these COVID pages are housed. And I got started through this project with him. So Safia kind of pulled me in after I started working there, and that's how I learned R. It was all on the job.
Wow, impressive. Great. Safia, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. So I was a research assistant at the Tax Policy Center as well. And I similarly worked with the state and local finance initiative a lot and also doing some of the federal tax stuff more broadly. I got into R. I took a class in college and my background was in economics and econ research geared towards policy. So the work that I was doing was more about like regressions and econ research things. And so my first exposure to parameterized reporting similarly was with this project. And I think that was like a testament to how flexible and easy to learn R is for so many things beyond just regression modeling. So it was a really cool opportunity. Erin pitched the idea of using R for that purpose and learned a lot since.
Nice. That's awesome. Erin, remind me, when did you kind of first get into R and how did that come about?
Yeah, so I studied economics in undergrad and I took an econometrics class and we learned Stata and I got, not forever Stata license and I graduated. I had no money and my Stata license expired. But I was really interested in this idea of working with data. I think it was actually my parents who had heard of this thing called R, and I should probably follow up with them and figure out how they knew about R. They said, yeah, it's free and it's pretty popular, and I guess you could make cool data visualizations with it. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And so I learned through Coursera with Roger Payne and Brian Caffo and all the people at Johns Hopkins, or maybe 8 years ago now. So it's at the time, I had no idea of all the types of things that you could do with it. And that's one of the great things about R is like, you just keep figuring out new things to do with it.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I mean, the book that I'm writing is tentatively called R Without Statistics. And it's all about, again, like all the things you can do that people tend to think of R as, data analysis, and there's much more that you can do. So, and I got connected to you all through an article that you wrote on the Urban Institute blog about using R Markdown to produce a set of reports So I'm actually bringing it up and looking at it. Actually, the article talks about two different reports, the State Fiscal Briefs, and then reports looking at the impact of COVID on state budgets. So let's focus on the latter, on the state budget, the impact of COVID on the state budget reports. Can you, at a very broad level, talk through what it looks like to create these reports? Because you have to produce one for each state. So how does our Markdown parameterized reporting work to be able to do something like that?
Well, Livia and Safia, I think, want to undersell all their hard work on this. But I mean, the main thing is there's a lot of different data sources that come into these reports. And as long as you have data structures where you have a variable where each row corresponds to a different state, then you can put together these are Markdown documents with parameters at the top, where then you use the render function from the R Markdown package and you say, Virginia, render the R Markdown, Vermont, render the R Markdown, and you just go through all the different states. That's at the high level, but I think one of the really cool things about this specific implementation is like all the stuff going under the hood to pull data from APIs and clean it and visualize it. So maybe Safia or Olivia can talk some about that.
Yeah. Sophia, I think you could probably talk more about the process of, how it was created. To get some clarity, I joined into this project after the pages were more or less, ready with it. But kind of to go off of what Aaron was saying, I think when we first started creating it and determining what we wanted to include in them, we made sure to kind of first create a general template of the types of data that we would like to include, the general text, kind of like boilerplate language that would fit for, across all states, and that we would be able to have data for all of them. So that was kind of the first basis of it. And that's, I think, what allows it to be parameterized. But yeah, and then it's just a matter of rendering and iterating through those scripts.
Yeah, and more at a high level of why we did what we did and why we used R. I think as the pandemic was starting, a lot of our colleagues were tracking different things that were happening in the states with unprecedented unemployment insurance claims in one area, and then governors doing different things with regards to lockdowns and different public health mandates. And we suspected that there might be a relationship between what the policy decisions were and what the economics were, and the different relationships between the industrial makeups of states and who are their workers and what their industries are, if they rely on tourism and things like that, and how that might be playing out in terms of unemployment and all these different things. But we needed to bring all that data together in a cohesive way for people to be able to understand how it all fit together. And so our Markdown provided the perfect way to have a cohesive set of information, all feeding in with each state being an observation and having all these different variables and a very clear way to visualize different relationships.
Let me actually put my screen up for a second and kind of take us to sort of the end product, so we can kind of look at that and then we can kind of backtrack from there. So this is the website that you created, which allows you to have all of these reports. So I think it's kind of random, but I somehow have North Carolina open. And so just from a technical perspective, you have all of this content from here up is just on the urban website, right? Here up, basically. And then this, my understanding is this down, starting at North Carolina, is what you created using our Markdown and parameterized reporting. Is that accurate? And
Yes.
so, okay, cool. So there are multiple pieces of this, right? There's unemployment rate. Can you talk, let's take one of these things, and I mean, feel free to tell me kind of which is the easiest one to talk through, but like talk about the process of going from getting that data to producing something on here. Is there a particular piece of data you think that would be easiest to talk through?
I mean, I think any of these, we can, the private employment, unemployment, all of those are coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and have a similar process underlying them. But I think for these, did we use the API? Maybe? Okay. But yeah, so all of this data is, for the most part, I think it's publicly available. And so it wouldn't, it's just a matter of combining all these data sources and putting it all together. And so for unemployment, we use the Bureau of Labor Statistics API, and that allowed us to pull in unemployment rates for all the states at different points in time. And different states they all experienced a huge spike in unemployment after the pandemic, but then they all kind of moderated at different paces and peaked unemployment at different times. And now we're all in different places. And so without having to go through and say, okay, this is when Alabama's peak was, and this is when Arkansas's peak was, with the API and after pulling in the data, we could very easily have functions that identified this is the peak month and this is what the level was. And we built that in so that it would identify those and created a little graphic that displays that. I don't know if either of you have anything to add.
Yeah, I can add some. So a nice benefit also of using the API is that where like it tends to be coming in the same format every time, whereas some of the other data that we have included in those pages, we're downloading it from the web. So for example, if you go up the page a little bit, there's the COVID case count and vaccination count. And those we download from CDC. And earlier this year, they changed the way that they were producing those data sets. And because it's something we first download and then, upload onto our, that like resulted in us having to change a little bit of the code to make sure we were pulling in the right numbers. And so it definitely is helpful to have APIs because they tend to be more consistent. But yeah, the different numbers and come from truly a variety of sources. But APIs are very beneficial.
So I'm guessing, I mean, tell me if this is wrong, but I'm guessing it sounds like there are three like phases. One is gathering the data. And I don't know if you do that like in a R script or like a series of R scripts is what I'm guessing you do. You go out, you gather all that data, wrangle it, get it into consistent formats, save that. Then you have an R Markdown document, which has the parameter top, in this case, it would be North Carolina. And then you finally have a separate R script file where you actually have the code that renders all of these reports. Is that an accurate summary of your overall process?
It's exactly right.
Okay, cool. So when I look at this, all I see is a single website or a single, page on the website. But under the hood, it's actually not that. Like we talked about before, this is actually being served from somewhere else. So talk about the process of serving the content like integrating it within the Urban website and how that works. And I don't actually know who the best person to ask questions to because I don't know who worked on which piece. So I'm just leaving it up to you to jump in.
Yeah, I can try with this one. So through our end, and by ours, I mean mine, Sophia, or Aaron's end, we would basically, render these files and we would create HTML outputs. And so once those are created for each individual state, we would then send it off to our comms team at Urban, and they would pull in the HTML files and upload it to the actual page on the website. So that step, I truly do not know how that happens. But we use GitHub to kind of track our changes and also to send these updated HTMLs to the people that then upload it. Is that kind of what you were asking, or?
Yeah. And even so, my understanding from reading your article is the state fiscal briefs, you actually, so for example, if I click on Oregon, say, you actually copied the HTML into the CMS from the rendered reports. Whereas with this, I mean, and I can even look at the code to see, but I think I checked this before. You actually have, yeah, an iframe here where you are serving this. It doesn't actually look like this isn't necessarily directly from GitHub. I'm guessing you then somehow push these from GitHub, or is that right? To somewhere on the Urban website. And then this is actually embedded. So for example, I mean, I'm guessing it would work if I replaced North Carolina with South Carolina. And
Yep.
so that's how you make, like, you have, in a folder somewhere on the Urban website, like 51 of these or however many. Is that right? And then they're embedded.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. And I think there's a historical reason for why the process differs a little bit. So I think originally for the state pages, the intention is to, or was to update them maybe quarterly. And so, copying and pasting HTML code for 51 states quarterly, it's not the most fun thing to do, but it's manageable.
Yeah.
When the pandemic happened, we wanted to have, I think, to be useful, a much more frequent flow of information. And so we wanted to have something where someone's not copying and pasting something 51 times every 2 weeks, which I believe is about how often the COVID pages are updated. And so that's why this iframe system came about. Just one other thing to focus on. We've hosted pages in a bunch of different ways, PDFs, GitHub pages, clearly with the CMS, with iframes. And this is probably the most mature process that we've used. In this case, it's actually pulling in all the CSS from the urban.org. So if the CSS evolves on the urban end, the pages should evolve to keep up with that. And so when Safia was developing these pages and I was helping her, we tried to basically emulate the CSS in our studio to match the Urban website. We developed one version, to sort of see what it would look like on the website. And then we finally iterated it and moved them all into sort of iframe environment.
So are you saying, like, does this then not have any CSS on its own and it just inherits from the Urban website, or you created CSS that matches what's on the Urban website?
Yes. So I think we have CSS locally so that we know what it looks like.
Uh-huh.
And I believe it's actually embedded in the HTML by default.
Okay.
We have a script that we run that's called trim HTML. So,
Okay.
you niche your document and it's, 10,000 lines of HTML code with CSS and JavaScript
Right.
all jumbled in there. And basically this trim HTML function goes in and says, give me exactly lines 108 to 8,749, because that's all that, our communications team wants. That's what we give to them. And then sort of everything else is then handled by the urban.org website.
Gotcha. So your output when you are working in R Markdown, is the output format just straight HTML document, or is it like HTML fragment, or what's the output in the YAML? Do you know?
Oh, it's just HTML document. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And
That's
then
because we want it to look pretty when we're looking at it.
Sure.
And then we chop it down to be ugly, and then the website makes it pretty
Makes
again.
it pretty again.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really interesting too, because it just shows like a way, that you can use R to both generate all these reports, but also, like you said, you have a function, the trim HTML function, which gets rid of all the excess, which is not, again, if people are thinking about R as data analysis, you're showing a way that you can automate this process that goes way beyond, the kind of data analysis I think people associate with R. Are there other parts of this process that you think are kind of interesting or that we should highlight?
Sophia hinted at this, but I mean, I do think it's interesting. One of the key challenges with this is like the language. So you want to unpack maybe a little bit more about how all the like narrative changes based on the data?
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing you're talking about, for example, here ranks North Carolina 24th highest in the nation. I'm guessing, Sophia, you're not going in and manually typing 24th each time this updates. So yeah, do you mind just talking about how that
Yeah. And I
works?
mean, I think one of the kind of funnest and hardest parts of this was making sure the grammar and all these things work correctly in a parameterized document where the numbers were really easy because R can calculate what the biggest number is and what the smallest number is. And then we had to think through basic rules of English that we don't even think about as native English speakers about like when do you use is and when do you use are and when do you use a instead of an. And so those were all things that we mostly embedded with like if else's in terms of if whether numbers were plural or not. With the 24th, we had North Carolina being the 24th highest in the nation with COVID cases. We had a ranking where we were calculating based on the daily COVID cases from the CDC, and then we could just populate. And then again, we had to whether it would be 24th or 32nd or whatever were things that we had to think about as just grammar rules, and programming that into R was kind of weird challenge. So yeah.
So did you have like a data frame that says, in one column it's like rank, and in the next column it's like, I don't know what you even call that, like it, whatever it's called, like rank order, like the 24th basically. So it would be, in that row it'd be 24, and then the next column would be 24. And then you use that to put that
I
text
think
in. Is
so
that
the
how it works?
24, we had a column that was a rank. And I think the TH or the ND or whatever it would be, I think we had in the template itself. And so we had, we were
Okay,
populating the variable from that column. And then we had, if it ends in a 4, then it's TH. If it ends in a 2, then it's ND.
gotcha.
And then we would discover our errors and realize that there was a
Right.
case we didn't think of and had to make one up for that too.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
2
Yeah.
versus 12, right? Second, 12. You have to, the
Right,
special
right.
cases always.
That's hilarious thinking about how you have to parse English like at that very granular level to be able to write the code that implements it so it sounds natural. Um,
It's definitely a little bit more work the first time you do it,
yep.
but now that this has been going on for 2 years, I think that that effort is like worth it. It sort of solved the problem once, and then it's solved for all times in the future.
When did you start this particular report? I mean, it says May 6th, but that's obviously not the first time you did it.
So we started this, well, the State Fiscal Briefs were the first sort of time that we attempted something on this level. Um, and I think
Yeah.
there had been within the state and local finance initiative, people had wanted to have background pages on each of the states for a very long time because we work with states and recognize that each states have their own history and demographics, and all these things really matter for the policies. But it was just that project never went off the ground because it was so much work, and there was like a Word document of one potential page, and the idea of creating that in Word for 51 states just was insane. And then also having to update it constantly. I think Aaron mentioned that we update these pretty often, I think once a month, but at first it was like, okay, this is something we can update once a year, and already that's going to be a very heavy lift. And so when I started, this
hmm
was something that got handed off to me. It was like, okay, this is like a classic like research assistant task of having to update all these pages and fill in all the numbers. And but then once we integrated it with R, it became so much easier, so much faster. We were able to update these much quicker and have information flowing much faster and also much more accurate because I mean, having things be accurate is something that we value a lot at Urban, and the idea of having someone checking every
For
single
sure.
number once we had done it, and the room for human error when you have 51 of these and are checking off of PDFs and Excel files and BLS website and all these things, every single number, it would have been impossible, and there would have been a lot of errors, I'm sure. And so using R Markdown made it not only quicker, but much more accurate. And we were able to pull in more information because of that and make more interesting calculations and observations.
guess,
and have it be much more visual, right? I mean, there's all these visualizations, which is really important too.
yeah, let's actually talk about that in 1 second. But I think, Sophia, that's such a great point, how it's not just more efficient, but it's more accurate because
Hmm.
you're automating it. I mean, obviously you have to write the code correctly and probably want to, take a good look at the code that you're developing and have other people check it. But once you're certain that the code is working as you intended to, you don't have to worry about those kind of copy paste errors that always happen, no matter how careful you are.
And if
Um,
if I can just add
let's
something to kind of on the
go
topic
ahead, Livia.
of this of using our markdown makes it a lot more efficient is we have another resource in the state and local finance page, which is backgrounders, and these are like similarly fact sheets about different types of tax revenues and expenditures. And those I think there's maybe like 20 or 15 of them. Um we do through like Word or through Excel, and then we upload the HTML to update it in the back end of the website. And it's very cumbersome, even with just like 15 of them, and we're only updating once a year. It takes several weeks and several RAs or,
Oh,
people to
wow.
be fact checking and updating numbers and things of that sort. So our markdown definitely helps with making it more efficient and also like less costlier. Because the more people that and the more
Yeah,
time that's spent on it, the more that they cost. So I think that's like another added benefit.
that makes a ton of sense. And clearly you all spent a bunch of time, when you first put this together, as you said before. But I'm curious now, what's the process like for updating these? Is it fairly automatic?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So I update them every couple weeks or so. I think now that the pandemic is, it's slowly edging towards an endemic, we don't update them as often as we used to. But it's very simple. A lot of the numbers that like we pull in, I just download the spreadsheet or, I call the APIs. I run some code. I knit one of the states to check and make sure things look okay. And then I iterate the renderings. And then, like I said, I kind of push them off to the communications team so that they can upload it to the website. And so it doesn't take more than half an hour. Uh, so very quick.
Wow.
I've also been doing it a lot. That it feels really easy. I know where I'm going and know where to get things. But even then, we've also removed some data. So there used to be more data specifically on unemployment claims, but we've taken those out. And so, as more time has gone by, and we're shifting to other priorities within our center, we've kind of taken a step back also and done a little less updating. But a lot of the numbers that you see are as up to date as we could find them.
Uh, well, and I think you make a good point. I mean, even though you said, oh, I've been doing this for a while, so it's really quick for me. It's possible to automate this to the point where you can do it quickly. If you are doing this by hand, no matter how fast you are, it's never going to be anywhere close to half an hour. It's going to be hours and hours and hours. So, um, I think that's something important to keep in mind. Um, Aaron, you started to talk briefly about kind of how it became more visual in the data viz. Can you talk, like, are there ways that switching to our markdown and parameterized reporting made it possible to be more visual? Or like, what's the relationship between the parameterized reporting and having the reports be more visual?
Well, I mean, I think that this is true of not just parameterized reporting, but anytime you use our markdown, ggplot2 is just right there. And so it's just such a natural fit to make data visualizations instead of, using narrative or even creating tables or things like that. I think just by reducing, it takes a long time to create a data visualization. And if you can, you know, get it to the point where you can iterate it as easily as what Livia just said, it makes it something that's more sustainable. You're not having to plug the data into Excel make sure your cell references are correct. There's always a cell reference error. And then, copy that as a PNG or whatever into the document. Maybe you have to do that 8 times per state, right? That's just not sustainable. There's just such a natural fit between R Markdown and ggplot2. Like, I almost think of them as 2 tools within it's sort of one tool, right? They're kind of linked in my mind anytime I think about one, I think about the other.
Yeah.
And so it's just such a natural fit in this application.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Well, let's talk about you and you all. Actually, I'll probably stop sharing at this point because these are more kind of general questions. So you all talked about this, but talk about maybe just even a bit more about how much more, like if you hadn't done this in our Markdown, and it sounds like there are other kind of similar iterated or reports at Urban that are done in a way that doesn't involve our Markdown. Like, can you expand a bit on that process and what that looks like compared to the process that you all have set up here?
I can talk about that, and Sophia, feel free to chime in because I know you've done work on the backgrounders before too. But yeah, this other resource or product that I was speaking about, we pull in data yearly from the Census of Governments, and relating to, like I mentioned, tax revenues and different sources of tax expenditures too. And it's very time intensive. And so we have kind of assign a person per backgrounder, and then they have to go in and update all of the images or all of the charts and if there's any tables or graphs. And so pulling in the data, from the Census of Governments dashboard that we have, and then adding it to Excel and kind of updating it, and then also updating the text and where certain numbers are referenced. And so it can be very tedious process and leaves a lot of room for error as well. And so once one person has a go at it, we have multiple people also checking and looking at the numbers and the edits that have been made to make sure that we're correctly calling the different data that's changed. And so I think it's vastly different with that process versus using our Markdown. And like I said, requires a lot more people and a lot more time. And even then, like, it has to go through multiple rounds of editing to make sure that we have everything correct. And even then we still can catch mistakes later on. And so I think it's just a lot easier with our Markdown. I think there's up front, there's a lot more labor and time that's put into it because you're, writing all the code, you're cleaning out the data so that you have everything that you need. But in the long run, it's a lot faster.
Makes a ton of sense. Aaron, you haven't convinced everybody else at Urban yet to switch to R?
I've done my best. So I will say, I mean, our use at the Urban Institute has gone up quite a bit in the last few years. There's also been a lot of people who have done this type of parameterized reporting. Maybe I can give a little bit of background here. I mean, the first time we did this was 5 or 6 years ago, and it was a huge lift then. A couple of things have changed that have simplified that process over time. The first one was, back then, there were lots of in-person convenings, and so people really wanted us to create PDFs. And anytime you have page breaks, it becomes a much bigger hassle. It looks great for Iowa, and then you go to Massachusetts and all of your page breaks are messed up, right? So that was a big challenge. But we, created a lot of LaTeX code that sort of made it so that the next person who create the template is starting from, an advanced place. We also have an R package for ggplot2 called Urban Themes, right? And that makes all the plots consistent. We have a R package called Urban Templates, right? So we actually have our own sort of branded HTML documents with the associated CSS. So now that we have that, it makes things that much easier. So, I mean, we did this 7, 8, 9 different times before we collaborated on this project together. One thing, the pandemic was terrible. One thing that changed during the pandemic is that there's no more in-person convenings. And so it was a much easier sell to say, hey, we can do this at HTML. And so then you're no longer fretting about page breaks, which honestly, it like saves a lot of time. And then also if you're going to be doing something every 2 weeks, you don't have to like look through the page breaks, which is not fun and also like really challenging. Um, I think there's one other thing uh, that's helped. Well, there's a lot more people at Urban that know R. That makes it a lot easier to do this, which is like a huge success from the past couple of years. And then the final thing is sort of, all right, we've made these pages. They could be for states, 51, but we've also made them for counties, so 3,142. I mean, that by hand would just be entirely impossible. But then there's this sort of question of like, oh, well, what do we do with these? And so working with comms, we have all of that templated now. Like we have the US map landing page where you can pick a state. We have a US map landing page where you can pick a county. And we've worked out some of this back end stuff. So instead of having to have a bunch of meetings every time you want to do this and like figure out what are we doing now, it's like, oh, hey, we want to do this project again. And everyone's like, okay, we know exactly how to handle that. So it's a process that's evolved and it's much simpler now than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I'll actually just say as an aside on the page break. So on the consulting side of my business, we do a lot of parameterized reporting and a lot of clients still want PDFs. And
Right.
so we actually use the page down package,
Right. Yeah. Oh,
which has been better. I don't actually know LaTeX, and I've just heard horror stories
Yeah.
from people. So I know HTML and CSS, so that's been much easier. But yeah, we had one report on census outreach efforts, and we had maps and charts and text, and with maps, like the shapes of the states all vary. And so everything,
Yep.
we had to write some custom code that would be like, if it's this state, put a page break before this. I mean, obviously things that you are familiar with, but yes, dealing with HTML is, I envy you being able to
Yeah.
work in HTML.
And there are things you can do with CSS to make them a little more printable. It'll never be as nice
Right.
as the highly formatted PDF. People really want that stuff to be printed. But you're right. I mean, it is envious because like that's not fun to think about.
Right.
And like I know that Livia and I met Safia and I know that everyone in TPC, like they want to focus on the content, right? They don't want to spend all their time thinking about formatting. So they want to spend as much time on the content. So that's a nice thing about the R Markdown with HTML. It's much easier.
Well, let me ask then one last question, which is, do you all have kind of advice, things you think about if people are considering doing parameterized reporting? I mean, just as an example, my general advice for people is typically keep your data visualization simple, because if they get too complex or if you have too many annotations, you just don't know what it's going to look like when you iterate it 50 or 100 times or whatever. Anyway, I'm curious if you all, having done this for a while now, have things that you've come to realize are kind of best practices when doing parameterized reporting.
Well, one thing I don't think we've talked a lot about is kind of making sure that you're aware of exceptions. And in the state pages, one really big one, for example, is Washington, D.C. So technically not a state, but we include it as a part of our pages. So there's 51 in total. And that, because D.C., it's not, the state isn't just North Carolina, we reference it as the District of Columbia, that ended up, like, we had to add in a lot of exceptions in our text, or even, for example, instead of having a governor, it has a mayor. And so I think that's really important when you're kind of figuring out a project that you want to use parameterization, is to think of, okay, are there going to be a lot of exceptions, or is it only a few? How is it going to impact the data that I want to use or the text that I want to have? Because that's like a big source of our Markdown file is a pretty long file, right? Because they're in certain aspects of a budget or data that they release, there are these exceptions as well.
That makes a ton of sense. Aaron, Safia, anything you'd add?
Definitely. So, I mean, the first thing is for any parameter that you have, definitely try sort of the shortest value and the longest value. So look at Iowa look at the District of Columbia or Massachusetts, right? Even when you don't have page breaks, titles can get clipped in data visualizations and things like that. We work a lot with people who aren't R programmers, so you always have to sort of be the translator between their vision and sort of what gets implemented. So definitely have the people who are coming up with what the design is going to be try and sort of create a static image of what they want things to look like. I find it's a lot easier to sort of implement a well-defined vision than it is to kind of endlessly tinker with a vision. And then when you're collaborating with someone else, some things are really easy and seem like they're easy. Some things are really hard and seem like they're hard. And then some things seem like they should be really easy, but are really hard. And so it's a conversation with the people that you're working with that may not understand everything that goes into creating their fact sheets, and just being like, how much are you wed to this one specific idea? Because it's going to be really hard. And they're always like a little surprised by that. But then more times they're like often surprised by like, oh, that part was like really easy and I thought it would be really hard. So, take the wins when you can, and then try to, avoid the really challenging things when you can.
That makes
Sure.
sense.
I mean,
Safia,
I think
anything you done?
the part of parameterized reporting is the idea of copy pasting the same thing over and over. So I would think in trying to think of your vision as like, what am I copying and pasting, and what are the themes throughout, and what are the things that make each page distinct? And that sort of helped us think through what the template's going to look like and what the commonalities are, and where, as Livia said, we want to carve out these exceptions and highlight important differences. And that really helped us figure out the structure, helped us figure out how to market the whole set of pages together.
Yeah, I think that I just want to piggyback on one thing there, right? Because I mentioned kind of draw out a picture of what you want it to be like. And then I often encourage people to like take a highlighter and highlight every single thing they think would change, or as Safia said, sort of copy and paste. And sometimes people realize like, oh, I'm highlighting everything. And it's like, well, then maybe that's not like a good candidate for the tool, right? And so then they refine it to where it's like, okay, I'm only highlighting certain words. Oh no, we have to change the TH to an ND, right? And little things like that. But that act of actually highlighting, I think, forces the content creators to maybe pare things down a little bit.
That is great advice. I'm thinking about that for the next time I'm working with a client who wants to do some kind of parameterized reporting. So, great. Well, thanks, all three of you. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat, and look forward to sharing this with people to help them learn more about parameterized
Thanks for
reporting.
having us.
Thank you, David.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you learned something new about how you can use R. Do you know anyone else who might be interested in this episode? Please share it with them. If you're interested in learning R, check out R for the Rest of Us. We've got courses to help you no matter whether you're just starting out with R or you've got years of experience. Do you work for an organization that needs help communicating effectively with data? Check out our consulting services at rfortherestofus.com/consulting. We work with clients to make high-quality data visualization, beautiful reports made entirely with R, interactive maps, and much, much more. And before we go, one last request. Do you know anyone who's using R in a unique and creative way? We're always looking for new guests for the R for the Rest of Us podcast. If you know someone who would be a good guest, please email me at david@rfortherestofus.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.